Thanks for coming along tonight on this cold evening, folks, for our discussion on net zero by 2050, two views. Now, Ed Cavanaugh makes a welcome return to the Sydney Institute. He is the Chief Executive Officer of the McKell Institute, and Aidan Morrison, a welcome first-time appearance at the Sydney Institute, Director of Energy Research at the Centre for Independent Studies. So we're going to lead off with Ed, we're going to go to Aidan, and after about half an hour we go to questions and discussion. So Ed Cavanaugh, you're very welcome. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Gerard. Let me just get this in the right position. How's that? Cool. Well, thank you so much for having me. Great to see you all here this evening. Can I begin by acknowledging we're meeting on the lands of the Gadigal people and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Folks, my name's Ed Cavanaugh. I'm the CEO of the McKell Institute, and it's an honour to return to the Sydney Institute here today. Gerard, thank you for extending me this invitation, and of course for all the work that you and Anne do here at the Institute. It's much appreciated. And Aidan, it's great to see you here, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. So, net zero is a sprawling economy-wide mission. So rather than navigating the myriad bureaucratic technicalities of the task at hand, I wanted to use this opportunity to explain why Australia is on this policy path, explain why Australia is uniquely positioned to capitalise on a net zero economy around the world, and also comment on how the opponents of net zero have, in my view, failed to articulate a credible alternate vision. So in my view, the issue of net zero is really characterised by two separate policy paths for the country. And the one is a very optimistic path, maybe an ambitious path, where we have a much more complex economy, where our mineral sector at home is adding value here at home, our energy sovereignty is enhanced, where we lead and don't lag on one of the most important international issues of our time, and when ultimately, yes, our environment and our climate is more stable and more predictable. And I think the alternative path is a path in which Australia is isolated on climate, is unbothered largely by what occurs beyond our shores, is stuck in this endless and futile culture war on energy, and that basically wants to spend the next 25 years dismantling the policy architecture that we've been arguing for and implementing over the last 25 years. So tonight I want to detail these choices and allow you to make up your mind about which of these paths is preferable. But first I want to lay some very basic foundations. So, if you consume your news largely from Sky or from The Australian, you'll probably have been digesting what I'd describe as net zero alarmism. And this is a view that says net zero basically means a return to the Stone Ages. No industry, no flying, no cars, no mining, all of that. Now, this is, of course, an absolutist caricature of net zero. Net zero is undoubtedly ambitious and complicated, but you can't forget the net in the title. Australia's current policy is that by 2050, we'll be aiming for net zero carbon emission, which will be achieved by scaling clean energy and sequestering remaining emissions from the hard-to-abate sectors. A net zero Australia in 2050 will still have emissions from fossil fuels, but this will ideally be occurring in the hardest-to-abate sectors like aviation and certain industrial activities, and not in the easier-to-abate tasks like turning on a light bulb or charging your phone, driving a car around a city. Emissions would be much lower, as close to zero as possible, with offsets and sequestration ideally capturing as much of the remaining emissions from the atmosphere as possible. And there'd of course still be externalities on energy generation under net zero, as there are today. But the objective is to mitigate the current externality that we're most concerned about, that is high carbon emissions, that's fueling anthropogenic climate change, which I do want to briefly touch on because, and I don't place Aidan in this category at all, but there is certainly a persistent denialism about human-induced climate change that does still inform this debate, particularly on the right of Australian politics. And it is important to state clearly that climate change isn't an issue of belief or ideology, it's just one informed by evidence and ever-increasing consensus. The planet won't be destroyed by climate change by 2050, but the historically unique pace of warming, which we're seeing at the moment, challenges the determinants of human flourishing and economic vitality upon which our civilization has grown. Now, I'm a pragmatist on this issue, I'm not an alarmist, but I think it's clear that this disruption is already costing livelihoods. And when it comes to Australia, these livelihoods are typically in the regions. And if you look at my home state of South Australia right now, as we speak, a quarter of the state's coastline is inundated with an algal bloom that on all preliminary scientific assessments is likely fueled in its intensity by warmer temperatures in the oceans. This is already costing jobs. And of course, we've seen things like this elsewhere. In the 2022 floods in this state of New South Wales, in which I reported on as a journalist, repeatedly inundated communities with historically atypical intensity. So if you lived in Surrey Hills around the corner, probably didn't bother you much. If you live in Gunnedah, where in 2022 the Namoy flooded 9 times, or just about every 6 weeks, I can tell you the prospect of an even more disruptive climate is a real life threat, not some political abstract. So it's already driving up insurance costs, it's already undermining investor certainty. Floods and algal blooms and bushfires, these have happened all throughout history. But the increasing intensity and cost of these events is certainly worth hedging against. Now, there's many that say they don't deny these issues, it's just that Australia's too small to do anything about it. And I fundamentally reject this notion. I think it shrinks Australia. I think it basically says on issues of international importance, we shouldn't do anything, even if these issues are affecting us at home. And if we applied such defeatist isolationism to any other international issue, we would rightly be outraged. But for climate skeptics, Australian isolationism appears to be a core objective. As the 14th biggest economy in the world, to say our transition is meaningless is defeatist and diminutive in the extreme. Now, it's your right to not care about climate change. It doesn't bother me if that's your position. But under the weight of evidence, the majority opinion of both electorates and governments here in Australia and around the world disagree with you. There is a near global political consensus in favour of action informed by science. And Australia would be foolish to run against this consensus, even if we didn't have opportunities in net zero. But fortunately, we do have opportunities in net zero, and we have much to gain from that transition. The first benefit is that net zero will enhance Australia's energy sovereignty. The alternative to net zero, as far as I can understand, is a future Australian economy dependent entirely on coal, or largely on coal. Coal has been essential to Australia's development. There are communities that still depend on it. It's still a very important part of our economy. But fundamentally, the domestic price of coal is subject to the global coal price, which has about doubled in the past 20 years. Our domestic coal market is inextricably tethered to that global market. So it's fantastical to argue that by doubling down on coal generation at home, the input price would just be magically lowered. In fact, the only way that this vision for a low-cost, coal-powered future would be realised is if Australia basically unhitched itself from this global market, if it simply diverted its exports to provide surplus cheap energy at home. But not only does this contradict the mainstream position on trade, it also undermines the investment logic on Australian coal, which is largely export dependent. 89% of Australian black coal, for example, was exported in 2022-23. So as long as we're tethered to the global market prices of energy inputs like coal, but also LNG, also oil, our domestic energy prices will be shaped by global forces. And that basically means that, any time a foreign dictator gets involved in a war, or there's a trade war that breaks out, or the oil cartel run by the Saudis and the Venezuelans decides to pump up prices, we carry those price shocks here at home. Coal generation, LNG supply, and also at the petrol bowser. So none of these energy sources are going away tomorrow. But there is a strategic logic that lessening our dependence on these inputs, even placing the issue of one side makes sense. The issue of climate to one side makes sense. And it is inaccurate to say that simply doubling down on these energy sources would be a silver bullet for prices, because it wouldn't be. So diversifying our energy and making more cheaper wind, solar and firmed energy at home will enhance Australia's energy security in the long term, lessen our exposure to the global energy market volatility that we're seeing, and I think that is a good thing in an increasingly volatile world. Now, Australia also has a unique set of opportunities that will allow it to seize upon the broader global shift towards net zero. There is a growing global hunger for greener industrial outputs, which Australia, with its abundance on clean energy, is in probably the best position in the world to pursue. Now, that doesn't make that easy, but it doesn't mean that there's no future for it, or that we should ignore this global market in the long run. And there's an opportunity that can see new value-adding industrial activity developed in Australia, supplying global markets that are embracing their own climate obligations, but also seeking to diversify away from the Chinese export market in particular. And in terms of critical minerals that will supply the world's transition towards electrified cities and economies, Australia is in the box seat to provide that supply. We are a rare earth superpower, and the demand for these minerals is skyrocketing. So the global pursuit of net zero, which we can help shape, delivers major opportunities for the Australian mineral sector. And I think Australia can also leverage leadership on net zero to sustain meaningful global influence on this issue rather than running away from it. So in my view, there are practical, strategic and economic reasons to embrace and to shape net zero. But to arrive at that conclusion, one must first consider the alternative pathway. And on that point, there is no credible alternative that's really being advanced. Opposition to net zero has become a litmus test for those in conservative circles. And to me, this is a great shame because its centrality to conservative politics now trumps so many positions that conservatives once held. Increasingly, this is a debate dominated by hyperbole and alarmism, each amplified by a narrowing echo chamber in Australia's right-wing media ecosystem. Once it was progressives who were criticised, often rightly, for favouring protest over outcomes. On the issue of energy and climate, this is now the conservative way. And those arguing that net zero has no future are often willing to bend and twist their principles to demonstrate their anti-net zero credentials. Now, let me give a few examples. Firstly, on China. Conservatives are at pains to often tie progressive governments to Beijing. But on energy, all I hear is that we should be doing what China is doing. We get told that because China's a bad climate actor, we have permission to be one too. That because China's doubling down on coal, we should too. Despite the increasing chest beating on the right about just about everything China does, it would appear that on the issue of climate, Beijing's policies are a source of inspiration. On the issue of personal and national responsibility, at the core of the Menzian political philosophy is the idea of responsibility, both of the individual and of the nation. On climate, so many of today's conservatives want Australia to shirk responsibility. They reject the notion that Australia should aspire to lead and to shape a global issue, but they even disrespect individual choices in favour of green energy, seen by household demand for solar and batteries, and at the worst, even ridicule individual choice by inventing vapid culture wars on issues like electric cars. So this is a politics that doesn't embrace responsibility, but it runs away from it and even mocks it. And then there's the disrespect for the popular mandate. All polling overwhelmingly, consistently shows Australians support climate action and net zero. So too has just about every election result in Australia, including the recent federal election. In South Australia, the Labor Party's ascendancy, for example, is aided and not hindered by its successes in clean energy. Yet this electoral reality is being denied by an entire side of Australian politics, showing, I think, a fundamental disrespect for the public will. Then on the issues of subsidies and government roles in markets. There are voices that one day will say they're fundamentally opposed to government involvement in energy markets, but then on the other hand advocated for a nuclear policy which would have represented the largest nationalisation project in Australian history. There are those that look at energy subsidy programs today as evidence that clean energy doesn't stack up, while ignoring the fact that much of our current coal generation was guided by the heavy hand of the state during an era of state-run energy networks. So the opposition against net zero is really murky. It is just largely anti-net zero, and it too often is informed by cultural politics, littered with philosophical contradictions, validated by straw man arguments, and is deeply unambitious about Australia's capacity to do big and challenging things. And I think the abrogation of this debate by the mainstream right is a bad thing, as it means there's less good faith debate around how we deliver on the ground a policy preference overwhelmingly backed by Australians. I'll finish with just a comment on the 2050 date itself. Now, we were talking about this before. I just had a young boy, he's only 4 months old, born in April 2025. And he'll probably be finishing uni by the time this date rolls around that we're talking about tonight. He'll just be 24 years old. And one of the joys I think a lot of you would recognise when you have a kid is that it suddenly extends your time horizon all the way to the end of their life, not just the end of yours. And the point I'm simply making is that 2050 isn't far away at all. In the case of my kid, you're thinking about his life in 50 or 70 or 80 years and you're suddenly well into the next century. Now, I don't think unchecked climate change will make Earth uninhabitable for him by then. But I don't think the world will end by 2050 if we don't implement these policies. But I do think that an Australia that turns its back on both the opportunities and the obligations of the global decarbonisation mission will be a much more challenging place to live than one that embraces, for all of its difficulties, this very epic, ambitious task. So I look forward to this discussion. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for having me here today. It's a pleasure to be invited to Sydney Institute. And thank you, Gerard, very much. Thank you as well, Ed, for an excellent contribution. It's really great to have, I think, two, I suppose, divergent views on what is such an interesting and topical subject at the moment. So I am going to be bold today. A week or so ago, I was at the Diggers and Dealers conference in Kalgoorlie, one of the largest mining conferences in the world. And I said that net zero is intellectually dead. There is no self-respecting way of now maintaining that it is possible to reach that pathway. And I want to extend that a little bit further tonight to say that I think that now it is morally dead as well. It has just become so clear now that the proposed cure is in fact worse than the disease that we are trying to solve. That sounds like a high burden of proof, but I want to advance to you today, I suppose, what are the recent, not revelations, but I think things that are starting to become settled and dawning into the public consciousness that have been more or less there in some vein of the analysis for quite some time, that I think change massively how we consider this target of net zero by 2050. First, let's briefly look at the disease. And I think that we can characterise this as something that in the popular narrative has been stated as though we have very high certainty about us having a very, very high degree of control over something that has a very high impact, a catastrophic impact. That is typically, I think, the general way the general narrative has been described. And I think that broadly speaking, that is wrong. It is true that we have high certainty about certain things, but we do not have high certainty about us having high control over lever that definitely leads to a highly impactful, i.e. catastrophic event in the near certainty. We're quite certain, for example, that there is a credible scientific method, a mechanism by which the greenhouse effect leads to carbon dioxide increasing the warming in the atmosphere. That's something that we know fairly certainly. But exactly how big a control humans have over the carbon, we have a fairly high degree of certainty, not quite as high, but there's a lot of evidence from the carbon-14, etc., in the atmosphere that fossil fuels are a big contribution to that. But then what that then does to the climate is where all the narrow bounds of high confidence starts to disappear, because the Earth is an extremely large and extremely complex system. And of course, when you consider the impact that you have, I think that just recently has started to become tolerable and in fact favourable to people that are climate science serious to examine seriously the scientific documents and point out that what they are describing is not in fact catastrophic. This is not a terminal disease that leads to the end of life as we know it on Earth. It can lead to change, it can lead to risk, it can lead to complexity, but it does not mean that we abandon all our cost-benefit analyses and consider that any price is worth paying to meet an existential threat deadline. So just some examples of that, which I think do pave the way, right? So recently, the Department of Energy, the Secretary Chris Wright has released a major report, and amongst the authors are people like Steve Coonan, who worked in the Obama administration as a climate expert, saying things in the executive summary, things like that carbon dioxide also acts as a greenhouse effect, exerting a warming influence on the climate and weather. I won't read every word. But he goes on to say is that global climate models generally run hot in their description of the climate over the past few decades, and that most extreme weather events in the US do not show long-term trends. Again, this I think is the start of the maturity of the pushback that claims to be very serious about the climate science, but very low on the catastrophization of it. We're not expecting a catastrophe that means that we need to become hysterical. And so I think that is just starting to emerge. The climate seriousness assesses climate change as a risk, as a serious cost. But so far, my broad contention is that we have been justifying the current suite of climate policies on the basis that it is such an immediate and existential threat that we do not need to soberly assess the costs of the policies we're proposing to address it. And that is broadly, I think, incorrect. Even just to highlight that a little bit further, the IPCC, International Panel on Climate Change, they produce some detailed documents, and I think in the middle of about 1,500 pages in, there is some of the analysis about the weather trends. And they say things like, a similarly reliable subset of the data representing tropical cyclone landfall frequency over Australia shows a decreasing trend in eastern Australia since the 1800s. A paleoclimate proxy reconstruction shows that recent levels of tropical cyclone interactions along parts of the Australian coastline are at the lowest in the past 550 to 1,500 years. So there's a lot more statements. The answer is this is a complex system, the big old world out there, but they do not paint the picture of imminent, certain catastrophe with high confidence we can attribute it all to human contributions. These are some of the tables that are discussing the confidence about the frequency and intensity of meteorological droughts, all right? We have medium confidence of decreases, everybody, in most of Australia. We have low confidence of there being, I suppose, intermediate trends, and all of these ones, even the rare ones that do have some medium confidence of increases, have a low confidence or limited evidence of human contribution to that trend. This is the science. The IPCC is not more climate sciencey than you can find anywhere. And yet this does not spell the narrative of imminent, certain disaster that is tightly tied to human contributions that has been widely portrayed. So, if the disease is not imminently fatal, we then have to assess the treatments soberly. And I think that now we have new information that is emerging, very serious information about the costs. That now I think the evidence has for a long time been discussed and advocated by many people, but yet it is becoming unavoidable for us to presently acknowledge that the costs are simply unbearable. Unbearable without catastrophic degrowth if we're to attempt to meet net zero by 2050. And the big picture is this. Our human emissions comprise of broadly three parts, which are very roughly evenly split in terms of the path to decarbonisation. The first third is electricity, our current use of electricity, which is dominated at the moment by coal in Australia and indeed in most of the world. Right, then there are a whole host of heating functions and certain transport functions which we propose to basically decarbonise by switching them to electricity. And then after that, the remaining third, which are typically thought to be somewhat harder to abate, are certain transport applications and also a range of chemical and industrial processes and feedstocks, for which the plan is to hydrogenify, basically use hydrogen as a substitute for those hardest to abate. So we have our own electricity, which is the first third, then electrifying everything, and then we're going to use hydrogen for all those difficult and feedstock chemical processes. The problem is this. We were told that the first third would not just be cost-free, but save us in terms of our energy costs because renewables were so cheap and abundant. And that now is a blatant falsehood. We cannot ignore the evidence that the move towards renewable energy to squeeze out coal from our system is going to drive higher costs. And then, if you take the premise that we have got higher cost electricity based on our renewable energy and you plug that into your electrify everything step, you end up with massive, terrible problems. And if you plug them into your hydrogen step, you end in utter disaster. That's the case that I want to make to you today, and I want to spell it out in a little more detail. There is now basically, I think, no studies except for CSIRO's Gen Costs, whose purpose and intent is to demonstrate the renewable energy adopted to a very high level of penetration. By renewable, I mean wind and solar. Hydro is a beautiful exception, if you're gifted with the geography for that. But for wind and solar, scaling up to high levels, I cannot find any piece of literature that now says what Gen Cost does, which is that it is still the cheapest way to go. And I have issues with Gen Cost that I just want to detail to you today. First, if you've read the headlines say that renewables are still once again the cheapest. But that is simply not the case based on the lowest credible costs in CSIRO's modelling, before you take any of my critiques of their later arguments and assumptions, right? They actually have coal at their lowest cost being cheaper than the integrated firmed renewables. So that is a great disappointment that CSIRO has not substantially revised their conclusion, where their facts in their own report absolutely does revise that. Secondly, the latest report from CSIRO's Gen Cost has revised substantially their own assessment. Let me emphasise this, their own assessment, before anything that I'm about to tell you that comes next, of what the integration of renewables to make them firm and reliable. Once you take energy that is from the weather, it's feast and famine energy. But to transform that into the reliable on-demand energy that we've built our society around takes extra stuff. CSIRO acknowledges that. 6 months ago, they said that extra stuff cost between $42 and $48 per megawatt hour. This time they said it's between $48 and $64. There is now no overlap. In 6 months, they have basically said their previous estimates were all wrong. And of course, I can go on. What about the capacity factor that's used to generate the range of different things? Their lowest particular capacity factor for renewables is only 10% below the average that they assess today, 10% below. And as we add more and more renewables, we necessarily get much, much higher degrees of spillage. And that is dramatically underestimated at the moment. They project even less than what we currently have today. Also, for their storage. It seems that they have not substantially changed their storage estimates in the recent times, even though estimates, including from Alex Wanhass, who is a former employee of CSIRO and Oricon, and informed the New South Wales Energy Transition Roadmap, has said that we may need to double the amount of storage we include in our integration pathway for several reasons, including because we haven't got the optimal balance of wind and solar. Also, the transmission. CSIRO's Gen Cost includes the same stack of costs in one of their tables for the committed and anticipated projects. It does not seem to account for the fact that AEMO has already reported up to 55% increase, and then a week after Gen Cost was announced, it turned out that it was over 100% increase for one of the largest transmission projects. There is no chance now, even I think that their current estimates are close on the integrated costs of renewables. And the upper bound, which is the only bound I think that is serious, because we already have some of the, very, very close to their worst performance capacity factors, is I think the only one we should take seriously. And that's around $176 per kilowatt hour. So if we're talking north of $200 per kilowatt hour, all my suggestion is you take that kind of number, north of $200 per kilowatt hour, and put that in your electrify everything modelling pipe and smoke it. That is utterly catastrophic degrowth. If you want to push all our heating, all our transport onto electricity that is not going down to well sub-historical lows, but actually escalating to never hitherto encountered highs. What about hydrogen? Hydrogen is, of course, far, far worse. And we now have evidence of this that we absolutely cannot ignore because of the latest subsidy deal that has been agreed to by Chris Bowen. And this is with Orica. Now, Orica produces ammonia. They produce it mostly for explosives to support the mining sector. But this is one chemical feedstock that they do not have to store it or transport hydrogen anywhere for. They use it to convert it straight away into ammonia. So it is the easiest possible use case, the most essential, necessary one. If it doesn't work in this application, it does not work anywhere. This is the first, easiest use of hydrogen you will ever find. And what are the subsidies that have been allocated to it? Over $500 million, all right, to transfer 7.5%, just 7.5% of Orica's natural gas demand, all right? If we scale that up to be able to actually replace all their natural gas demand, it would cost $6.5 billion. And if we were to scale that up to meet what we project to be required in the integrated system plan, it would cost somewhere well over $100 billion. The cost of decarbonisation for this project is not $2 per kilogram. The cost of decarbonisation is not $30 per tonne of carbon abated, or $40, which is what the cost of Australian carbon units currently are. It's closer to $1,100 or $1,200. All right, so this is an insane degree of subsidy that we're actually encountering here. So rather than actually looking at this and saying there's some hope for hydrogen, this should be the ultimate final nail in the coffin that says that hydrogen cannot, will not ever work. Even if the electrolyzers are completely free, you need electricity somewhere around $20 a megawatt hour instead of $200 a megawatt hour to make that actually compete with the current steam methane reformation process. So to conclude, I just want to ask you, is it worth the cost, given that we do not have a terminal, fatal, imminent disease? Think about this. A toilet. Have you ever encountered a net zero toilet before? Challenge to the room here. Hold in whatever is in your guts for today until you get yourself to a net zero toilet. No ceramics, no plastics, no steel. Think about the pipes that take it away. There's still around 1 billion people that don't have adequate sanitation in the world today, and around 1 million people every year die because of the preventable diseases that arise from that. If we are proposing, which we now know we are, to make the basic inputs and building blocks of our life, like steel, ceramics, cement, fuel, mobility, shipping, cold chain for food supply and imports, if we want to make all those things between 3 and 20 times more expensive, are we doing something good for humanity or bad for humanity? And I think now that we know that renewables are very expensive, it is the latter, and there is no intellectual or moral case to continue supporting net zero. Thank you.
We invited you to talk about 2050, which you've done, but what about next week? There's a comment by Penny Sharp, who's the Energy Minister in the Labor government in New South Wales, reported in today's Daily Telegraph, having told a Labor meeting that New South Wales will really struggle to not have blackouts when Eraring closes down in a few years' time. Now, she's on the left of the Labor Party. She's not someone who is opposed to action on climate change at all. But what about the short term? How serious is that, just looking at the state of New South Wales? So we'll start with Aidan, we'll go to... So come up to the centre and talk to me.
Sure, I'm intimately familiar. My team at Centre for Independent Studies has spent all day putting in an objection to a rule change request to remediate the problem of system security, as in to replace all the inertia, stable voltage waveform that we got for free from all our big spinning machines. We have to buy a whole bunch of new machines to replace that. And at the moment, the current plan is for Transgrid to get a couple of $1 billion roughly to buy some of the kit and ask for a few more $1 billion roughly to maybe start procuring some combination of batteries from some assortment to later to be determined private suppliers of batteries that we don't know for sure will solve the problem, but they're showing a bit of promise, and we think that will help. All of the scenarios in that proposal show that if Eraring closes in 27, we will have serious risk about 2 to 3% of the time of system security shortfalls in lots of New South Wales. That is blackouts, right? So they've capped the costs or the benefits of resolving that at 60 billion or something like that, because basically all the scenarios show that we are headed to massive amounts of blackouts in that period. So this is absolutely real. There is not a chance that Eraring will be able to close in 27. Believe me, if they found a way, they would have written it in this document, which is the request to solve this stuff. And so yet there is still this narrative, and there is still the assumption that's going to be put probably in the ISP that it closes at that time. So again, I'm hugely disappointed with so many of the institutions who are basically trying to softball and slow roll the clear bits of news that illustrate that this is not working. We haven't got a pathway that works here, and the cost is yet to be resolved and very high to try to remove and replace our baseload thermal generators with wind and solar.
Yes.
No, look, I agree. It is, yeah, it's incredibly hard to execute this transition. I said at the outset in my remarks, I don't think this is a simple, easy, not complex pathway. On Eraring specifically, I think, penny sharps being practical, if that's the case, when the evidence shows that there's going to be some sort of impact on system security, like governments are going to respond to that pragmatically. The issue on blackouts generally, I mean, this debate has been framing my entire life, basically. Like, I'm in my mid-30s, I don't know, you're probably similar, Aidan. We, like, the climate discussion has been dominant since I was a kid. And there is a perennial argument that next year there's going to be more blackouts, that the year after there'll be more blackouts, and the system hasn't necessarily delivered upon that. So I think there's genuine risk, and we do have to be careful about the transition. You can't just click your fingers and pretend these challenges don't exist, but I also don't have that same fear necessarily about about Eraring specifically, but about blackouts more broadly as well.
Rafe?
Thank you. Rafe Champion, energy realist. Now, I want to ask Ed a very specific question. Bearing in mind that wind and sun are the basic inputs required to get wind and solar power, what is the plan to handle a month like June 2017 when there were no less than 10 days and nights had no sun obviously, and next to no wind overnight, 10 days and nights in a month?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's where basically all the plans over the next 20 years are for there also to be firming technologies in the system, including gas. And I'm broadly in favour of that as well. I don't think you can click your fingers and just solve the problem overnight, like I was saying. So there's challenges with intermittent energy that everyone accepts and agrees with. I think the greater penetration of them into the network more broadly is a good thing overall, given emissions needing to come down. I think that's an aspiration that we should support. But again, there's practical challenges to this, which I accept. I think there's, a big role, for example, for gas. In South Australia, for example, they had, other generators and stuff that were there for system security. So I accept there's challenges with intermittent energy, of course, but I do think there's ways to mitigate against that.
Yeah, I just think that there is a technical possibility there where you can have multiple redundant layers of backup system, and they move between totally different varying states according to the weather, from having all your power energy supplied by the wind, to all of it being supplied by the sun, to all of it being supplied by gas, all of it supplied by interconnectors to different places. That is what South Australia currently has, and they've only had one major blackout, and you can spend the money on a whole bunch of systems, but I don't think it's ever going to be a cheaper system. And I think we've got to keep in mind here that this is the bargain we were always sold, is that this is also a cheaper system. There's just not a chance it's a cheaper system, and I think there's going to be a lot of lessons learned on the cost of all the machines to make it a reliable system. I'm not saying it can't be done, but at the moment we are figuring it out, and there's many more different states that system can fall into that you won't have encountered all of in the real world until you hit them. And I think it could be one day a reliable system, but there's no chance that it's going to be lower cost than what we're used to.
Hi. It was all very interesting on both sides, but I'm just an ordinary person here. And listening to everything, there's a sort of fervour, almost religiosity to the idea of global warming, whatever it is, climate change. But if you look at the algae in South Australia, it's nothing to do with Australia because we're about 1.5% of world emissions. We're not causing the algae. If there's huge climate change and huge droughts and floods, and this is all about climate change, however it's caused, why aren't we doing more to live with climate change rather than trying to upend our whole energy system? Wouldn't it be better to work out how to people to live in areas where they didn't have floods, or to work on ways in which we can look after ourselves in the event of so much climate change? Wouldn't that be a better investment?
Okay, Ed.
Yeah, happy to jump in. Look, on the first point, I agree that there's one of the problems with this whole debate, and this is why I really respect Aidan's contribution to this, is that so much of the energy conversation is being caught up in basically like a cultural politics and that type of debate, which is often just untethered from the policy outcome that we need to achieve. And if you agree that we need to decarbonise for various reasons based on the evidence that you see, then that's actually quite a practical and technical process rather than a cultural politics one. I said in my remarks, I don't think in 2050 the world's going to switch off and end. I do think there's, though, a degradation of systems which can be lessened if there is lower emissions overall. So that's my view on that. In terms of Australia engaging the world on this issue, I do think it's really important that we do make a contribution to a whole number of international issues. I don't think it's really good enough for the 14th largest economy in the world on an issue which is broadly agreed to and has a large consensus around the world to just abrogate ourselves from any responsibility for it. I don't think that's a practical way to engage internationally. I don't think it's fundamentally good for us. And it's certainly, if the 14th largest economy in the world doesn't contribute to this, why would the other 180 odd countries behind us bother? So yes, China, the US are absolutely critical in this, of course, but that doesn't mean every other nation, in my view, doesn't have a responsibility to.
Look, I would say, firstly, just to respond briefly to what Ed said, I do agree in the idea that we should do our share of whatever the right thing to do is. I don't think that the idea that, we will, if everyone adopted the position, they will only do something after everyone else has already done their fair share and will be the last person to join it. I think that's not a particularly morally strong position to adopt. So I'm not opposed to the idea of us being carrying our weight and doing our share. But I do think we have to be sober-minded about the reality that I think, and I would characterise it differently, most of the world now, certainly most of the emissions, are not doing almost anything, right, to meet net zero. It just won't happen. So if you've got the US, China, Russia, India, Indonesia, I mean, they're making noises about it, but just like watch what they do, not what they say. And so I just think that we have to be sober-minded about the fact that we will still encounter the costs and the risk to mitigate, which is that we're going to have to be able to do the mitigation measures as well. And so I start to look at questions like, well, what would it take if we had, another foot of sea level rise over the next 50 to 100 years or something like that? And if you can still access low-cost steel and cement, rebuilding our buildings in a foot different sea level is not implausible. Same thing with temperature. Like, there's certain farming areas, if you enable us to use all the piping and plastics and diesel we want and fertilizers that we want, like, it's actually quite plausible that we can deal with that in a pretty moderate kind of way in terms of the human impact. But if you say, let's take away, and I know this is characterising extreme position, I'm not trying to attribute to it. If we say, well, let's take away or increase by a huge multiple all our plastics, fertilisers, diesel, cement, steel, then you're really cutting off your leg before you're attacked by the beast that you're going to be encountering anyway. So I think is a nonsensible position to adopt.
I've got a question here from one of our Zoomers who is an economist, Dimitri. He says, in your presentation to Ed, there was a noticeable absence of numbers. What are the economic cost of net zero? Are they calculable?
Well, I mean, look, there is. I do think there's some cost to transition. I think on the point of renewables being, no, of course there is. I mean, it's like, I don't think there's no cost involved at all of this. We talked about the system security stuff. There's investments in that for sure. I made the point though in my remarks that it's not like just doubling down on some of our existing generation would just be a silver bullet for costs as well. We have seen the global price for a lot of other energy inputs over the last decade, 20 years have risen. We are fundamentally tethered to global markets on, of all of the sorts of fossil fuels that we rely upon. So there are costs to transition. There are costs to our current system. I think we need to be honest about both of those. But the fundamental goal of the energy transition is based around a climate consensus, which is common around the world. There's obviously economies where they're not doing enough, and that's a big issue. But that's fundamentally the policy objective. It's not necessarily to deliver, the lowest cost energy solution, which probably would be coal, I would imagine, if you just had that throughout the entire system. So that's what policymakers have decided. That's been taken to election after election, and that's broadly what the Australian people have been backing, and that's framing what our policy pathway is on this issue.
Yeah, I would love to, because I think that what Ed has described is, I think, the relatively sensible adult debate that we should be having, which is acknowledging there are costs and trying to figure out what is an acceptable cost and how to get the least cost version and staging the timeline and the targets to be managing the costs that we have an appetite for. And I think that's the mature adult conversation. But I just want to point out, that is not the conversation. That is not the deal that was struck with our current political rulers. They have been adamant all the time that moving towards renewable energy is going to put downward pressure on your electricity bills, all right? And that is simply not the truth. So I just think that there's a mature, sensible conversation to acknowledge the costs and then try to size them up and figure out your appetite, and there'll be a spectrum in sort of how much people are willing to spend there. But I think until you get over to that level, you are having the total fantasy fairies at the bottom of the garden kind of like, this will also help make everything free and wonderful and turn us into a superpower, which is just such utter puerile nonsense. Unfortunately, politicians are, there's no accountability other than voting them out, but they have been backing this. And I'm extremely disappointed with the institutions such as CSIRO, such as the Australian Energy Market Operator, such as the regulator, who have avoided, I think, the statutory obligations and expectations that we have in our public institutions to kind of falsify the nonsense and be speaking truth to power. Because they know, I think it's blatantly clear that they now know there is no low-cost downward pressure really in front of us. But yet they're bending over backwards. I could chew your ear off all night if you want. In instances where they have been not forthcoming in exposing the nonsense and allowing the natural process that should weed out high-cost directions from our regulatory system.
It's arguable that this country has been deindustrialising for some time. We've been carried really by the mining industry and the agricultural industry for many years, yet you're proposing to virtually decimate both those industries.
Well, I am not proposing that. I wouldn't agree with that entirely, so I think that's a mischaracterisation of my position. I am... One of the interesting things about this debate, actually, I mentioned that at the outset, there's a sort of exaggeration in some way that if you're in favour of climate action, you're opposed to mining and you're opposed to agriculture and all this sort of stuff, and it's just not the case. I mean, I think there's fringes on the debate that would say that, but some of the fringes on the right of the debate that have just an absurd position too. There is a way that you can absolutely have a thriving mining and resources sector in a economy that is largely driven by electrification. Like it is feasible to do that, but that's a really difficult thing to do, and it means that you have to aspire to that over many decades. So I accept that as a real challenge, but in the global market for the inputs into basically decarbonised economies, Australia is also in a really unique position to leverage that, and that's largely through all the rare earths opportunities that we have in the mineral sector. So at the moment, we're really dependent on coal exports, and that's a huge part of our economy, and I think we can't downplay that. In the longer term, as we diversify away from coal, then there's a really big opportunity in rare earths, and I think we need to capitalise on that, and that's what I'm aspiring to with this policy. It's certainly not getting rid of the mining sector, which plays an absolutely critical role to our economy and our future.
Look, just briefly, I think I have a different view to Ed. I think I would say that agriculture and mining would be at severe risk if we pursued to zero. Like if that's the target, I'm not saying there aren't things that we could do to decarbonise them a bit, but I think that the target being zero is going to pose a risk. Things like bulk explosives, heavy machinery, rock grinding and crushing. That said, I'm a new convert actually to renewables, to wind and solar. I think I found the best possible application for them. And that is actually, ironically, in remote mine sites where there's no one for miles around, no social objection, no agriculture going on. Very hard to get your diesel and your gas to them, all right? So because diesel at a road site costs more than an inland site and costs more than gas, gas is already 4 times the cost of black coal, which is 2 or 3 times the cost of brown coal, which is similar price to uranium. The cost that it makes sense to install wind and solar at to save your fuel prices, actually out in those remote mines, is much better than what it is on the grid. So there will be better opportunities there for using wind and solar than there are in the grid, and yet we're throwing untold amounts of public money at trying to push uphill against all the market forces, more wind and solar into our current grid. So anyway, just a spurious tidbit. I mean, I think that you'll see more wind and solar at remote mines than we should see in the big grid.
So the question there, just keep it together.
Yeah, of course, sorry.
Sure, sorry.
As someone relatively new to Australia, the thing that has astonished me consistently here is that there's all this talk about diversifying energy sources, decarbonising, etc., and yet there seems to be what appears to me to be a completely irrational opposition to the most obvious way of doing that, which is nuclear. I guess that's there's a question implied in there.
All right, we've got a question about nuclear power, yeah? Nuclear energy.
Well, I'm happy to jump in. Yep. Look, so at the outset, I have no ideological opposition to nuclear energy. I don't know why. Again, it's captured in some culture where I don't really understand that. On the very specifics, though, obviously there's a background to this. We voted to have a moratorium 25 years ago or whatever, that stifled probably an opportunity to pursue the nuclear path 25 years ago or so. The policy that was put to the Australian people last year was, earlier this year, was not an appropriate way of doing it, even if you supported it. It was basically changing every couple of months. There was a blank check from government to basically underwrite it and own it, and then it changed a couple of months later. It wasn't really, I think, a serious contribution. It couldn't make up its mind between small modular reactors or large reactors. The idea was that you could just plug in the reactors into the existing distribution infrastructure and off you go. That is not a good way to introduce the concept of nuclear energy to the Australian public, and I do think that was a disservice to the debate more broadly. But we've fundamentally, this is the problem. We make our choices on this stuff a long time in advance, and we are not having nuclear in our system now is the consequence of generations that have preceded Aidan and I, not just the ones that voted in support of the moratorium 25 years ago, but also those in the 70s and 80s that refused to accept this as an alternative to coal power. So I think this conversation would be much easier if we did have nuclear in our system. I don't think the numbers stack up to necessarily attract private investment into it at the moment. But again, I don't have any ideological position to it, but I think it's improbable that we're going to see it in the market in any
Aidan,
time
you want to
soon.
make a comment?
Yes, I think I disagree with Ed on a few of those points. Firstly, just the question about kind of whether technologies or things get caught up in a culture war. Because I find that a little bit perturbing, because sometimes I find that the accusation of being engaged in a culture war is really levelled just when someone tries to point to a fact that you don't want to discuss, all right? So it was accused, I think there were people accused of reopening a culture war, which you thought you'd won, but actually, I think when you're pointing to facts and saying, actually, this won't work, and you're trying to point to the information, it's really frustrating. I hear it a lot, to be accused of then reopening a culture war, when really what you want to do is debate the actual evidence. I disagree with the characterisation of the Liberal Party's policy on nuclear energy. It did have flaws, but I don't think I'd pick any of the ones that Ed described there. I think that overall it was much better than average or expected, and it would have been a great step in the right direction. They'd, by the end, ditched small modular reactors, adopted large scale, or implicitly large scale, put them at sensible sites. There would have been other sensible sites, I wish they'd left in as well. But I think that was a relatively credible policy. What was, I think, not credible was the position they then adopted regarding renewables, which was then to say, we think that renewable energy is also half the solution to the climate problem, but at least half the cause of all the economic problems. I think that was the position that left, I think, the Liberal Party with an unclear and unconvincing approach, where they were open to accusations of there being some other force behind why they're introducing nuclear and wanting to delay something that they couldn't say they didn't want to move towards, which is more renewables as well. So that was, I think, an unconvincing position to take. But I disagree. I think it was actually as far as nuclear policies goes, it was pretty good first effort.
I've got another Zoom question from Ben. Has the Department of Energy in Canberra ever modelled the effect of a high renewable system in terms of consumer electricity prices?
I would not have the answer to that. Maybe you do, Aidan. I wouldn't be familiar with every output that they've made.
Yeah, I do. Not the department so much. There is a different organisation called the Australian Energy Market Commission. The Commission has a policy advisory function. They also write the rules that the regulator enforces. So anyway, there's a cavalcade of quangos, but AEMC, the Market Commission, is kind of at the top of it. And they used to produce a document called the Electricity Price Trends Review every 3 years, and they have a terms of reference for doing this, and it was quite a good factual document that required them to basically anchor their analysis in an existing year and project forward 3 years based on what they knew was in the pipeline for the transmission, the distribution, fuel forecast, the mix of electricity. And that was a really, really great document. And then it stopped in 2022 when the Labor Party took office, and the excuse was around the Ukraine war and COVID, and it was difficult to model things, which, I mean, that might be difficult. I think your best effort done transparently would still be okay. But then it was restarted again just last year, a few months before the election, and they tore up their terms of reference. Instead of anchoring it in a known historical year and projecting forward based on things that we know will happen in the next 3, they basically did a 10-year projection based on assuming everything in the integrated system plan which is all government policies, 82% renewables, will happen. And all the stupid assumptions in the integrated system plan, like we won't count the system costs of all the batteries we imagine you'll buy and gift back to the system for free. So this is an absolute travesty, because it used to be a very serious and thorough, good document. But right before the election, it was changed into more or less a piece of fan fiction for the integrated system plan, which, again, I could chew your ear off all night if you want to get me started on that one. And so it is meant to be done, but it is not being done in accordance with the terms of reference that it's been given before. And I think that's probably one of my top-of-the-list examples of organisations abandoning what should be their proper statutory obligations and just flying off in a different direction to basically reinforce a narrative that we now know is so false. This is not going to be the cheapest source of electricity.
So we're getting very close to the end, so you've got to be very quick.
Yeah, sorry, just a very sort of quick one. And look, my numbers will be just guessing, but is it in Victoria they're talking about Poles and Myers and the price has gone out to $11 billion or some idiot figure like that. Surely you can put up a nuclear plant rather than Poles and Myers destroying farmland, destroying open land where the turbines have gone, open land where the solar panels have gone, whatever. Like, for heaven's sake, the cost of Poles and Myers and the land that's being used has to be looked at, maybe nuclear.
Cost of poles and wires.
Look, I just think, again, this is we're living through the consequences of. I mean, the proposal was often, let's just plug in a nuclear reactor, and I do think the policy they took to the Australian voters was underthought. It didn't go and engage communities. It did a disservice to that debate in Australia, and now it's very, very unlikely that will ever be advanced again. And the Liberal Party will probably move away from it. And so the reality is now that that's been knocked off the table by generation after generation after generation, even if it was a better solution. And this is a situation which we're now living in, where there's these really challenging externalities from coal and from gas, which may have been abated if we had nuclear energy, which we don't, because the Australian people and because of generations that have preceded us have basically said that's not the way forward. So now we're navigating a very complicated path, largely without nuclear in the mix.
Want to make a comment, Aidan?
Yeah, I would firstly just disagree with that characterisation of the coalition's approach. And if you'd note carefully, some of the few seats that did receive a swing towards the coalition were the ones where nuclear reactors were actually proposed. So I think the lack of consultation is kind of...
Except in Grey, where they held on by about 5 votes.
Sorry, where?
In South Australia.
It's South Australia.
Yeah,
Yeah, but South Australia is not a serious site anyway.
Okay.
But the thing I wanted to say moreover is that if you look at the capital costs of some of the equipment that's implied for the firming, not for generation, but for the firming and the backup and the storage and stuff like that, you absolutely do quickly get to what I'd call nuclear numbers, tens of billions of dollars, before you've even generated anything. So I just think, like, take Pioneer Burdekin, $34 billion, Barumba Pumped Hydro, they say it's 14 now, but it's probably much higher than that. Take Snowy, $12 billion, take VNI West, that's sort of 7 or 8, but could be 11, plus or minus 50%, like it's still hopeless. Take HumeLink, that's 4.5, take Western Renewables Link, this is all one chain, by the way, to link up. Take the HumeLink, Sydney Ring South, this is just to connect up Snowy Hydro. You've easily got to $20, $30, $40 billion, and this doesn't produce electricity, it's just the firming, right? So, like, you could have, for that money, bought a nuclear reactor which actually produces the power, produces in a location, doesn't require really any significant grid upgrades. So I think on that metric, it's one of the many metrics where I just say it is not intellectually defensible anymore to mount this cost argument. I'm not accusing Ed of making that, but I just think there is no one that in good faith can say this is going to be cheaper.
Okay, a final question over here. Got to be brief.
Thank you. Look, I'd just like you to address what seems to me an inconsistency. I live on the Central Coast and I've seen Munmora Power Station closed down, so we're burning less coal. I look out to sea and I see coal ships lined up exporting our coal. Is there something that's better for the planet for the coal that's exported rather than the coal that's burnt in Australia?
No, there's not. And I think we completely rely on coal exports still as well, of course, as part of our economy. Coal remains a very important part of our energy mix too. It's not like we're not burning coal here, but there hasn't been the investment in the generation. There's an ageing fleet of coal plants, etc. And as I've said a number of times, the consensus view in the Australian public, reflected by election after election in state after state, federal election after federal election, is that there is an appetite for transition in this, and that is what is being implemented by Australian government. So this is a complicated debate, but that has been the debate that's been had for a quarter of a century, and this is where we're at. And the consequence of that is there's less coal in our system over time. But of course, we still have this reliance on exporting coal as well at the same time. So obviously there's no technical difference between the coal burnt here or elsewhere, but that's the path we're on, and that's the policy choice that we've basically made as a country.
Yeah, just briefly, in terms of what there's an appetite for, there's an appetite globally for coal, and it has never been higher, all right? And I think that is something we just have to acknowledge. The idea that there is some push, some consensus position, some inevitable outcome where it's shrinking and declining is not the case. The world is consuming far more, and I think when you ask the questions about can or should they develop, should they have low-cost, reliable electricity, and coal is the lowest cost, reliable electricity. What about producing steel? Like if you're gonna take people out of slums and put them in proper buildings, steel, cement, coal is in all of that. It is going to happen. So what seriously is the proposal? Now that we know that you can't do this cheaper with renewables, do you really want to stop exporting coal from a humanitarian perspective? Do you want to stop India and China and South Asia and Africa from developing? Because the renewable nonsense has been called out now. It is just not cheaper that way. You can't do the same stuff, steel, cement, ceramics, low-cost electricity, with the wind and the sun.
Just one final brief question. If you both came back here before the next election and the lights were still on, what do you think you'd be able to tell us? We'll start with you.
Well, I'd look at my much derided in this room state of South Australia, my home state, in which there's been real success in this area. There's a sort of trope and a caricature of the state in which energy prices are too expensive. There was a blackout in 2016 and it's become a sort of pariah. Meanwhile, got on with the job. There's about 70% renewable energy in that system there. It's performing well, but also it is, seeing more and more coming into the system without that, some of the worrying impacts that we've been seeing. So I think I'd be interested to see the case study of my home state in a couple of years' time based on that trajectory.
Look, I'm worried that I won't be able to tell you anything new that I can't already tell you today. I think the same warning signs we currently see in terms of projects being announced to be deferred or pushed back or go up in 50% cost, this is the same sorts of signals that we will see for the next few years. And it worries me because I'm not confident there will be any blackouts. They will just defer and extend and kind of fudge the numbers and downgrade the forecasts. And so at the moment, we're just ignoring all the flashing red lights that are there on the dashboard in front of us saying this is not working. We will have a raring extended, otherwise we'll face blackouts. What other flashing red light do you want to see? The costs will be there, they'll be going up, but they'll be hidden by subsidies. So I am afraid that before the next election, there'll be no news that I can't already tell you today. And so the question is do people actually wake up and start calling a spade and responding to the evidence that we have right before us at the moment?
Now, before I make a very brief thank you, I just want to assure people who are watching, particularly in South Australia, that Anne and myself are very fond of South Australia, and particularly its wine exports. But for tonight, thanks to both of you for a terrific discussion. It'll go well on when it's shown for those who are going to watch it on the camera, and it'll make good papers for the Sydney papers, which Anne puts out. And thanks to the audience for being very polite and courteous and indicating you're well brought up by hearing both our speakers. So well done to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you.